I'm going to talk a little bit about the progress that we've made, because I think it's important to understand, recognize perhaps, that workforce engagement is something, well, I actually described it, the SLT, the leadership team, as a nettle that we've been kind of nervous about grasping. I'm not sure why. When we voted this morning, and you voted this morning, we all voted this morning, we voted that integrity, understandably, was number one. And then we had competence, human factors, and engagement, kind of more or less the same place. They're really all about our people. Those three, ranked more or less the same, are all about our people. Yet, for some time, I think we've been nervous about grasping this nettle. And I think it's time that we did, and I think we can now grasp that nettle. 2010, actually our journey started 2008, late 2008. 2009, 2010 was beginning to grasp this nettle. The quote that you see on the slide there, Understanding the Challenge, is actually from Jake Malloy. Jake's been a key member of the work group, as has Steve Walker, actually, going forward. And of course, when you listen to Jake, you just get that piercing insight. In the last two words in this, common sense. Yet we all know how hard it is to actually enshrine common sense in everything that we do. But in grasping this nettle, 2009, 2010 was really trying to come to terms with what do we mean by workforce engagement? What are the components of workforce engagement? And we began to realize that it was something to do with behaviors. And behaviors can be positive or negative. What sort of behaviors actively encourage engagement? At the same time, any of us that have dealt with safety reps, anybody that's been offshore, understand that there are barriers to engagement. Sometimes they can be unconsciously implemented barriers. Sometimes they are tangible barriers that prevent workforce engagement. Again, Steve referred to the prohibitive cost of attending events, stuff like that. You know, those are barriers to engagement. And we began to realize that, you know, that combination of barriers and of behaviors, and barriers will lead to a culture of engagement. And yet again, another name check, Martin Ellens led in 2009, 2010, the first attempt where Step Change attempted to assess the sort of culture that you could see on different installations. So we had a number of Step Change representatives visit different installations. And we began to realize that actually it is possible to measure, as we all do with surveys, culture on an installation. And that really was beginning to formulate the approach which we are now proposing as the step change model for workforce engagement. Something to do with behaviors, something to do with barriers, leads to a culture of engagement. So 2011 was when we actually then really started to get to grips with this. 2010 was about work groups or sub-work groups working underneath the parent. 2011 was really grasping this nettle and creating this working formula. And in the introductory slide, there was reference to a survey tool. The workforce engagement is a practical guide. The Step Change Workforce Engagement Toolkit is really trying to provide a set of tools that are available to anybody to foster and improve workforce engagement at a work site. It's not just offshore, it's any of our work sites. We do tend to home in on the survey tool, but the reality of the survey tool is only one aspect of the totality of the engagement toolkit, which we hope to share with you later this year. But that said, we did test the survey tool this year, and I'd like to acknowledge the fact that 10 MDs from this workshop last year volunteered their work sites to participate in the trial of the survey tool. And Rod, as CEO of Consult, volunteered his work site, which interestingly enough is an onshore work site, but it's part and parcel of the totality of our industry. And he's going to talk to you about the experiences of actually running the survey, what he was able to do with that survey. But we tested the survey tool. It's a web-based survey tool on 10 work sites. There were old installations, new installations, floating installations, drilling installations, onshore work sites. And so we felt that that was a representative sample of the industry, with perhaps one piece missing, and I'll come to that in just a second. But thanks to the site leaders and the workshops that are referred to, yes, we engaged at the networks meetings with the elected safety reps, with site leaders, but the workshops were actually OIMs, practicing OIMs. In fact, I don't know what to call it. Do I call it a gaggle of OIMs, a cadre of OIMs, a roughy-toughy group of OIMs? I don't know what to call them. But we had 10 OIMs who were passionate about actually testing this survey tool because they saw the benefit in actually trying to give them information which could allow them to identify where there were opportunities for improvement. So we had over 830 responses. 830 people chose the result of that pilot to give us information about how they viewed engagement at their work site. And so 2012, having now tested the model, tested the formula, and I'll talk about that in just a second, 2012 for us is about engaging with that other piece of our industry which wasn't included in the pilots, and that's the subsea side of our business. And again, it was tremendous for the work group when we actually started talking about the trials, the survey, the information, the use that the OIMs were making of that information, where the subsea sector said, we want to be part of that. So we're actually going to go out and push that trial out to include the subsea fraternity. And that's important because we need to make sure we get the language right. The language that you use on an onshore work site is different to language we use offshore, is different to what we use in subsea. But if this is going to be a tool that's genuinely useful to our industry, we've got to get that bit right. So that's really part and parcel of the validation. And then later this year, we fully expect to be able to launch the toolkit, so that everybody, you in the room and everybody else, has access to the toolkit. And again, I would just like to say that this is not just the survey tool, but you are going to hear, and in fact, you're going to be sort of practicing using some of the questions from the survey tool in just a moment. But it is the totality that I'm really trying to encourage you to think about this morning. So the model that we used, my co-chair Mike Boyer, if there's one thing he's good at is keep it simple. And this is a very simple model. On the one side, we've got positive engagement behaviors. Positive engagement behaviors, and it intrigues me that I was very glad that Les said, he almost forgot Steve Walker's presentation, because otherwise you might accuse me of having stitched this all together. And I didn't. But in Steve's presentation, he said that a lot of operators have guidelines for senior leaders on what to do and say when they go offshore. Well, these behaviors that we'll be able to share with you, the sort of behaviors that encourages engagement, they are part and parcel of those guidelines for senior leaders on how to behave when you're offshore, how to demonstrate engaging behavior when you're offshore. The four titles, visibility, communication, involvement, and support, are the four sets of behaviors which we think, as a work group, think that if we are demonstrating, then it doesn't matter whether you're the MD, a safety rep, an OIM, or somebody who is actually out at the sharp end. We've developed a suite of behaviors for each sort of category, level of our workforce, from the very senior to those at the sharp end. How do they each demonstrate behaviors which encourage engagement? We also have to acknowledge that there are obstacles to workforce engagement. Now, the workforce engagement toolkit doesn't specifically address, for example, condition of plant and equipment. That really is the asset integrity story. Adequacy of process. Ken mentioned this morning that hypos, large contributory factor hypos, not following processes, or the processes aren't adequate. But we also have to acknowledge that our own behaviors can have a negative impact on engagement. That could be unconscious, but I'm also reminded of stories in the past, I don't hear them that often nowadays, of the dinosaur behavior, the OIMs, the supervisors, doesn't matter who or where we are, MDs for that matter, the sort of behaviors that can actually positively discourage engagement. So the simple model is one of, if we can encourage positive engagement behaviors, if we continue, and I do believe we are addressing those barriers, but if we continue to address those barriers, if we remove those barriers, that will encourage a culture of engagement. Now, I wanted to highlight at this point, what do we mean by culture? A culture of engagement, because it is quite specific. 4 behaviours on one side of the slide: visibility, communication, involvement, support. 2 other behaviours which we think are important to engagement: participation and challenge. So the culture isn't one just of compliance. We would like a culture of compliance. We're aspiring to a culture of engagement, which means we positively encourage participation and we positively encourage challenge. In exactly the same ways I think we've been challenged this morning by Steve, who has challenged us as to whether we are getting the best out of our safety reps, or indeed broader than that, the best out of our workforce. I've said that it's not just a survey tool. What we are encouraging is a process, and nothing new in the world. Plan, do, check, improve type process. But it has to start with a desire for change. This process has to be kick-started. Desire for change. Understand areas of strength and area of improvement. Clearly, you need something to help you with that, and that's where we think the survey tool absolutely finds its place. It is a means of benchmarking your work site, and now it is benchmarked not against last year or previous surveys. It is benchmarked against the peer suite, the data, the step change. The 830 responses now sit with step change as a database from which we can assess the engagement across industry. And that's why this has the potential to become a leading indicator. And I mean leading indicator, not lagging. It's not, number of incidents we've had. It's, are we engaging with our workforce as a leading indicator, which will ultimately lead to that improved safety performance.